"You don't need to come to the funeral," my sister said. "It's for people who actually loved Mom. I paid for everything, the flowers, the casket, the headstone." When she showed up late, the priest read a letter with her name on it. She went pale before the first line was finished. The phone call felt like a shard of ice pressed against my ear. My sister Clara's voice was as smooth and cold as polished marble. "The service is on Friday," she said, the words clipped, devoid of any shared grief. There was a pause, and I knew what was coming next. I had been bracing for it ever since the hospital called, ever since the world had tilted on its axis. "But you don't need to come?" she continued, the practiced sympathy in her tone making it all the more venomous. "It's for people who actually loved Mom." The line went dead, but the silence it left behind screamed. It was an accusation that had been echoing in the background of my life for years, a constant, low hum of Clara's making. Alara, the difficult one. Alara, the disappointment. Alara, who broke her mother's heart. For a moment, I just stood in my small apartment, the phone still clutched in my hand, and let the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it wash over me. She had finally said it outright. The subtext had become text. My own sister, telling me I was not welcome to mourn our mother. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound. A physical blow that had knocked the wind out of me, leaving me hollow and strangely calm. My grief for Mom was a vast, silent ocean inside me, and Clara's words were just a stone skipping across the surface. The real tragedy was already unfolding within. But her challenge, her final, audacious attempt to erase me from our mother's life, and now from her death, sparked something else. Not rage, not yet. It was a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She wanted to curate our mother's memory, to be the sole arbiter of her legacy, to stand at the funeral as the perfect, grieving daughter. She wanted to own our mother's death, just as she had tried to own her life. I hung up the phone and made a different call, the first of many. I called the funeral home Clara had mentioned, the one in our hometown. My voice was steady, unnervingly so. I identified myself as Eleanor Vance's daughter. "I'll be handling all the arrangements," I said, the words feeling foreign and powerful in my mouth, "and I will be covering all the costs. Please send any and all invoices directly to me." There was a brief, surprised silence on the other end of the line, then a polite, "Of course, Miss Vance." I chose the casket, a simple, elegant cherry wood that Mom would have liked. I chose the flowers, a cascade of white lilies and gardenias, her favorites, the ones she grew in the backyard before she got too sick. I wrote the check for the cemetery plot next to my father, and then I selected the headstone, a modest granite slab, and dictated the inscription, "Eleanor Vance, beloved mother, she is at peace." In the days that followed, I existed in a strange state of suspended animation. I moved through the world, but I wasn't really in it. My grief was a private, sacred thing, a room inside me that I kept locked. The outside world was for logistics. It was for dealing with florists and stonemasons and a soft-spoken funeral director who treated me with a gentle deference that felt both comforting and deeply wrong, given what my own sister thought of me. Clara, I assumed, was busy performing her role as the grieving daughter for the benefit of our extended family, soaking up their sympathy, her face a perfect mask of sorrow. I imagined her telling them I was too unstable to be involved, that I was distancing myself as I always did. It was her favorite narrative. I didn't correct her. I let her spin her web. I let the relatives call, their voices laced with pity and a faint, frustrated disapproval. "Alara, honey, Clara says you're not even helping with the arrangements. Your mother would have wanted—" I would just listen, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. "I'm handling it," I'd say, and leave it at that. They didn't understand. They couldn't. They had only ever seen the play Clara directed. The day of the funeral was gray and damp, the sky weeping a miserable drizzle. I arrived early. I wanted a moment with Mom alone before the performance began. I walked into the hushed, lily-scented chapel and saw the cherry wood casket, surrounded by the flowers I had chosen. It was beautiful. It was right. I walked up to it, laid my hand on the polished wood, and finally, the tears came. Not for what Clara had said, but for everything that had been lost. For the years Clara had stolen, the phone calls that went unanswered, the letters I was told Mom was too tired to read. For the woman who had taught me how to bake, who had read me stories, whose scent of lavender and vanilla was the first safe thing I had ever known. "I love you, Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. Sorry for not fighting harder, for not seeing through the lies sooner, for believing, even a little bit, that I was the problem." I took my seat in the front queue, a solitary figure. My Uncle Arthur, my mother's brother, arrived a few minutes later. He was a kind, quiet man who had always looked at me with a sad, knowing expression. He sat down next to me, placing a large, warm hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence was an anchor. The chapel began to fill. Relatives and friends of my mother filed in, their gazes sliding over me, some with curiosity, some with pity. I could feel their judgment, their confusion. Why was the unloving daughter sitting in the front row, while the devoted one was nowhere to be seen? I kept my eyes fixed on the casket. This was for Mom. Nothing else mattered. The service began. The priest, Father Michael, a man with a gentle, weathered face, spoke of Mom's kindness, her warmth, her love for her garden. It was a lovely eulogy, but generic. It missed the fire in her, the sharp wit she'd had before the illness softened her edges. As he was winding down, the heavy doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, and there was Clara. She made an entrance, of course. She was dressed in a ridiculously expensive black dress, her face a carefully constructed masterpiece of tragic beauty. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her makeup was perfect. She paused at the back, letting every head turn, ensuring everyone saw her, the grieving daughter, arriving late because her sorrow was just too overwhelming. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and then began her slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. smile, her gaze sweeping over the assembled mourners. Her eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped. I saw a flash of pure, triumphant malice. She thought she had won. She thought this was her stage, her final victory lap in the long campaign to own our mother. She gave me a tiny, pitying smile, as if to say, "Look at you, all alone. No one believes you. No one loves you." She took her place on the other side of the pew, leaving a conspicuous gap between us. Father Michael, momentarily interrupted, cleared his throat. "We have one final tribute," he announced, his voice filling the quiet chapel. Eleanor left a letter. She requested it be read at her service. I saw Clara straighten up, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. A letter? She hadn't arranged for a letter. She must have assumed it was something a friend had written. Father Michael held up a cream-colored envelope. The envelope says, "To be read by my daughter Clara at my service. But as Clara has only just arrived, and given the circumstances, I will read it on her behalf." He looked at Clara. She gave a small, magnanimous nod, a little smile playing on her lips. She was probably imagining a sweet, sentimental note praising her for her devotion. A final, public validation. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it. The moment I had been orchestrating all week. I had found the letter tucked away in a shoebox of old photos while I was looking for a picture for the memorial card. It was in Mom's familiar, spidery handwriting, the script growing shakier toward the end. I knew what it said. I had read it 100 times, the words burning themselves into my memory. Clara shifted in her seat, composing her face into an expression of tender anticipation. She was ready for her standing ovation. Father Michael opened the letter. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest Clara," he started. Clara's smile widened. She glanced at me, a flicker of smug pity in her eyes. And then, the priest read the next line. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and I have failed to make you understand the cruelty of your actions." The change was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from Clara's face as if a plug had been pulled. Her carefully constructed mask of sorrow didn't just crack, it shattered. Her mouth fell open slightly, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. The blood left her cheeks so fast she looked like a porcelain doll. Her breath hitched in a tiny, audible gasp that was swallowed by the sudden, thick silence in the chapel. She went from performer to prey in the space of a single sentence. The smugness, the confidence, the triumphant malice, it all evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly terror of a cornered animal. She looked wildly from the priest to the casket, and then her gaze locked with mine. For the first time in my life, I saw her without her armor. I saw her for what she was, small and terrified and utterly exposed. The silence in the chapel was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from shock and confusion. Every eye was on Clara, then on the priest, then back to Clara. You could have heard a teardrop. Father Michael, bless his steady soul, seemed momentarily taken aback by the first line, his brow furrowed, but he was a man committed to his duty. He had been asked to read a letter, and he would read it. He took a breath and continued, his voice resonating with a new, somber gravity. "I have spent these last years in a prison you built for me, Clara," he read, my mother's words echoing through the funereal hush. "A comfortable prison, with soft chairs and warm meals, but a prison nonetheless. You told me Alara was busy. You told me she was angry with me. You told me she didn't want to see her sick mother. You took my phone and said you would pass on messages, but I see now that you never did. You read my letters from her and told me they were full of demands for money, when all they held were pleas to see me." A low murmur rippled through the pews. I saw my Aunt Carol, who had called to chastise me, put a hand to her mouth. My Uncle Robert's face was a thundercloud of dawning comprehension. They were all looking at Clara, whose face was now a ghastly shade of white. She was shaking her head, a tiny, frantic motion, as if she could physically negate the words hanging in the air. I remained perfectly still, my hands clasped in my lap. My own grief was a sharp, piercing thing. Hearing my mother's pain laid bare was an agony beyond words. But beneath it, a current of pure, cold vindication was rising. This was not revenge. This was truth. This was my mother, finally speaking for herself, using the only method her daughter had left her. Father Michael's voice did not waver. "You managed my finances," you said, "to make things easier for me. You brought me papers to sign telling me they were for bills or taxes. I trusted you. I was tired, and I was sick, and I trusted my eldest daughter. I know now what those papers were. I see the withdrawals from my pension, the checks cashed in your name. You told me I was running out of money, that we had to be careful, while you bought new cars and expensive clothes. You sold my mother's jewelry, telling me it had been misplaced." Clara made a choked, strangled sound. She half rose from her seat, her eyes wild. "Stop," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Stop it." But the priest continued, his gaze fixed on the letter. "You did this not for need, Clara, but for control. You wanted to be the good daughter so badly that you had to invent a bad one. You isolated me from the one person who saw through you, the one person you could not manipulate as easily. You broke Alara's heart, and then you used her pain to break mine. You told me she had relapsed, that her sobriety was a lie, knowing it was the one thing that would terrify me into keeping my distance." That was the line that broke me. A sob escaped my lips, raw and ragged. My past struggles with alcohol, years behind me now, had been the weapon she'd wielded with the most devastating precision. She knew it was Mom's greatest fear for me. Uncle Arthur's hand tightened on my shoulder, a solid, grounding pressure. He leaned in close, his voice a low rumble in my ear. "It's all right, Alara. We hear her. We hear the truth." The letter was nearing its end. "I write this not with hatred," the priest read, his voice softening with the echo of my mother's forgiveness. A forgiveness I wasn't sure I could muster myself. "I write this with a profound and bottomless sorrow. I love you, Clara, but the thing you have become has cast a shadow over my final days. And to my Alara, if this letter ever finds reminds you, please know this. Not a day went by that I did not miss you. Not a single moment. My love for you was the last clear thing in my mind. Do not let her poison your memory of me. Live your life, my fierce, brave girl. Live it free of these shadows. The final words fell into the stunned silence. Father Michael carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He looked out at the congregation, his face etched with a deep pastoral sadness. Let us pray, he said softly, but no one bowed their heads. All eyes were on Clara. She was on her feet now, her chest heaving, her face a contorted mask of fury and humiliation. Her act was over. The stage had collapsed beneath her. She was sick, Clara shrieked, her voice high and shrill. She was confused. Her mind was gone. Alara put you up to this. She forged it. She's trying to steal my inheritance. The accusations were wild, desperate, and utterly unbelievable. The woman who had just been publicly unmasked was now trying to direct the same play, but the audience was no longer buying tickets. My Uncle Arthur stood up, his 6-foot frame a wall of quiet authority. That's enough, Clara, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You will be silent, you will sit down, or you will leave. You will not desecrate your mother's memory a moment longer. For a second, I thought she would lunge at him, or at me. The hatred in her eyes was pure acid, but she was outnumbered. The faces staring back at her were cold, their pity curdled into contempt. She looked like a cornered wolf, snarling and afraid. With a final, guttural sob of pure rage, she turned and fled. She practically ran up the aisle, her expensive heels clattering on the stone floor, a sound of frantic retreat. The heavy chapel doors slammed shut behind her, the noise echoing like a gunshot. In the ensuing quiet, I felt a strange and profound emptiness. The victory was hollow. The truth was out, but it didn't bring my mother back. It didn't erase the years of pain, the stolen moments, the lies I had half believed about myself. It was just a wound, finally lanced, weeping in the open air for all to see. After the service, I was enveloped, not in suspicion, but in apologies. Aunt Carol embraced me, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Alara, I'm so sorry. We should have known. We should have listened to you. My cousin Mark, who had always been closer to Clara, just looked at me, his face pale. I had no idea, he stammered. One by one, they came to me, the enablers, the ones who had bought Clara's story, their faces a mixture of shame and sorrow. I accepted their apologies with a quiet nod. I was too tired for anger, too numb for recrimination. Only Uncle Arthur seemed to understand. As he drove me away from the cemetery, after I had stood alone watching the cherrywood casket being lowered into the damp earth, he spoke. This isn't over, you know, he said, his eyes on the road. I know, I replied, my voice hoarse. The funeral was just the public unveiling. The letter was a declaration of war. She mentioned inheritance, he continued. Your mother's will names Clara as the executor and the primary beneficiary. She wrote it 5 years ago, before she got really sick. Of course she did. Clara would have made sure of that. The house, the savings, what little was left after Clara's systematic plundering, it would all go to her. The perfect, devoted daughter. The letter, I began, is powerful, he finished for me, but it's not a legal document. It's your mother's testimony. To make it count, you're going to have to fight, and she will fight back, Alara. Dirty. I looked out the window at the rain-streaked landscape blurring past. The cold resolve I'd felt after Clara's phone call was returning, hardening into something more durable. Steel. Let her, I said. I'm not the person I was. She taught me how to fight, just by surviving her. She has no idea who she's dealing with anymore. The first step I took was finding the right lawyer. Uncle Arthur recommended a man named Benjamin Carter, a specialist in estate litigation and elder law. He was sharp, empathetic, and, most importantly, he didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like a client with a case. I sat in his polished mahogany office, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and I recounted everything. Not just the letter, but the years leading up to it. I told him about the slow, insidious campaign Clara had waged. It started subtly. Mom's getting a little forgetful, Alara. It's better if I handle her bills. Then it escalated. I wouldn't call this week. She's not feeling well and gets agitated easily. Then the outright lies. Mom said she needs some space from you. Your intensity is just too much for her right now. I explained my own history, the bout with alcoholism in my early 20s after my father's sudden death, my hard-won sobriety, and how Clara had masterfully weaponized that vulnerability, painting me as perpetually on the verge of collapse. Ben listened, taking meticulous notes. He asked pointed questions that forced me to dredge up painful memories, to put a timeline to the gaslighting. When did you first notice you couldn't get your mother on the phone directly? Can you recall specific visits that were canceled at the last minute? Did your mother ever mention financial difficulties to you? It was excruciating. Each memory was a small cut, but as I spoke, laying out the narrative thread by thread, I felt a shift. I was no longer just a victim of the story. I was becoming its narrator. I was taking the chaotic, painful mess of the past decade and forging it into a coherent account, a case. The letter is our cornerstone, Ben said, leaning back in his chair. It establishes your mother's state of mind and her awareness of the manipulation. It's a powerful piece of evidence for what we call undue influence. But on its own, it's not enough. Clara's lawyers will claim exactly what she screamed at the funeral, that your mother was not of sound mind when she wrote it, or that you forged it. I didn't, I said, my voice flat. I know, he said gently, but we have to prove it. We need to build a fortress of corroborating evidence around that letter. Bank statements, medical records, witness testimony. We need to paint a picture so clear and so damning that no judge can ignore it. And so began the slow, grinding work of engaging the system. The next few months were a blur of paperwork and procedural battles. Ben filed a petition to contest the will and demanded a full forensic accounting of our mother's estate, dating back 10 years. years. Clara, through her high-priced legal team, fought back at every turn. Her first move was character assassination. Her lawyer filed a motion to have me declared an unsuitable party to the lawsuit, attaching a lengthy, salacious affidavit from Clara. It was a masterpiece of fiction, painting me as a vindictive, mentally unstable alcoholic trying to extort money from my grieving family. It detailed my long-past struggles in lurid detail, twisting my recovery into a fragile, temporary state. It claimed I had a history of manipulation and lying. It was essentially a formal, legal version of the story she had been telling people for years. Reading it felt like being physically assaulted. Every insecurity, every past mistake was twisted and presented as my fundamental character. For a few days, I spiraled. The old voices of self-doubt whispered that maybe she was right. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was just doing this out of spite. The temptation to just give up, to let her have the tainted money and retreat back into my quiet life was immense. It was my rock-bottom crisis, happening not in a bar, but in my own living room, staring at a stack of legal documents that declared me worthless. I called my sponsor, a woman named Sarah, who had seen me through the worst of my recovery. Her voice was a lifeline. "This is what they do, Alara," she said calmly. "This is the disease of addiction, and it's the disease of a person like your sister. They want you to feel small. They want you to doubt yourself, because if you doubt yourself, you'll quit. Don't quit. This isn't just about the money. This is about you refusing to be the person she says you are." Her words, and a long, difficult session with my therapist, pulled me back from the edge. I started to see Clara's attack not as a reflection of me, but as a reflection of her own desperation. Ben was unfazed. "This is standard," he said, looking over the affidavit with a grimace. "It's ugly, but it's just noise. We respond with facts." Our response was a meticulous, point-by-point refutation, supported by letters from my therapist, my employer, and Sarah, all attesting to my stability and long-term sobriety. We also began the painstaking process of evidence compilation. Ben subpoenaed a decade's worth of my mother's financial records. When the boxes of statements arrived, we spent weeks poring over them, me and a forensic accountant named Maria. It was like learning a secret language of theft. We saw the pattern emerge: small, regular cash withdrawals that started years ago, increasing in frequency and amount as Mom's health declined. Then, larger transfers to accounts that Maria, through her investigative work, traced back to Clara. We cross-referenced the dates of these transfers with Clara's credit card statements, which we had also subpoenaed. A $5,000 transfer from Mom's savings account was followed a week later by Clara's purchase of a luxury handbag. A $10,000 withdrawal coincided with the down payment on her new SUV. It was brazen. It was sickening. The most damning discovery came from a series of checks. Mom's signature was shaky, but legible, but on the back, the endorsement signature was clearly Clara's. She hadn't even bothered to forge Mom's name. She had just signed her own, as if the money was already hers. Maria flagged over $80,000 in questionable transactions. While the financial case was building, we worked on the human side. Ben wanted to find witnesses who could testify to Clara's control and my mother's isolation. This was harder. Many of the relatives were now caught in Clara's web of loyalty and guilt. She was calling them constantly, weeping, telling them how I was dragging our family through the mud. "You have to stop this, Alara," my Aunt Carol pleaded with me over the phone one night. "Clara is a mess. You're tearing this family apart for money." "She stole from our mother, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice tired. "She lied to all of us. The money is just the proof. Your mother wouldn't have wanted this," she insisted. "She would have wanted peace. Mom wanted me by her side," I shot back, the anger finally flaring. "She wanted me to be free of Clara's shadows. I'm honoring her wishes. You should have been there to protect her, but you weren't. None of you were. You were all too busy listening to Clara's stories." I hung up the phone, shaking. The pressure was immense. Clara was using the family as a weapon, trying to emotionally blackmail me into submission. It was during this period of intense stress and isolation that we got our first real breakthrough. Ben had hired a private investigator to discreetly interview some of my mother's old neighbors. Most were reluctant to get involved, but one, a retired nurse named Mrs. Gable, who lived across the street, finally agreed to talk. I met her with Ben at a coffee shop. She was a small, bird-like woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. "I never liked that, Clara," she said, after stirring her tea for a long moment. "She had a way of smiling at you that didn't reach her eyes. Your mother, Eleanor, was a lovely woman. We used to have tea in her garden, but in the last few years, it stopped. Clara was always there. Always had an excuse. Mom's not up for visitors today. Mom's sleeping." Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her voice dropping. "One afternoon, about a year ago, I saw Eleanor sitting on her porch. Clara was out. I went over. Eleanor looked so sad, Alara, so lost. She grabbed my hand, and she whispered, 'She won't let me call Alara. She tells me Alara hates me.' I told her that couldn't be true, and then Clara's car pulled into the driveway. The look on her face when she saw me with your mother, it was terrifying. She hustled your mother inside, and the next day, there was a new caregiver there, someone Clara had hired. I never got to speak to Eleanor alone again. Her testimony was devastating. It was independent, third-party corroboration of everything my mother had written in her letter. Mrs. Gable agreed to sign an affidavit and testify if needed. It was our evidentiary turning point. We now had the letter, the financial proof, and a credible witness. The fortress Ben had spoken of was being built, stone by painful stone. Clara's retaliation was swift. Her lawyers filed a motion for a gag order, claiming I was harassing elderly neighbors and trying to taint the witness pool. They also sent me a settlement offer. It was a pittance $20,000, and it came with a thick stack of non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements agreements. I would have to publicly recant my accusations, agree never to speak of the matter again, and walk away. Ben laughed when he saw it. "This is a desperation move," he said. "She's testing you, seeing if she can buy your silence." "Tell her to go to hell," I said. The legal battle dragged on for nearly a year. It was a war of attrition, fought through motions, depositions, and discovery requests. The deposition was the hardest part. I had to sit in a conference room for 8 hours while Clara's lawyer, a slick, merciless man named Peterson, grilled me. He brought up every painful detail of my past. "Miss Vance, isn't it true that during your period of, shall we say, instability, you frequently borrowed money from your mother and sister?" "I borrowed money from my mother, yes, which I paid back," I said, my hands clenched under the table. I focused on a spot on the wall, just as my therapist had taught me. "Ground yourself. State the facts. Do not engage with the emotion. And isn't it true that you had a volatile relationship with your mother, often getting into loud arguments?" "My mother and I had disagreements like any family. I never had a volatile relationship with her. But your sister Clara, she was the peacemaker, wasn't she? The stable one? The one your mother relied on?" It went on and on, a relentless attempt to chip away at my credibility. But I held firm. I had the truth on my side, and for the first time, I had proof. When it was Ben's turn to depose Clara, her composure crumbled within the first hour. Faced with printouts of her bank statements next to her mother's, she couldn't explain the transfers. "I was just helping her manage her money," she insisted, her voice rising. "She told me to take it. It was a gift." "So your mother gifted you $87,000 over 3 years while simultaneously, according to your own account, she was worried about paying her bills?" Ben asked calmly. Clara's face was red and splotchy. She was confused. "I don't know. This is a witch hunt." After the depositions, Clara's lawyers pushed for mediation. They knew a trial would be a disaster for them. The hearing was scheduled in a sterile conference room at a retired judge's office. It felt anticlimactic after all the buildup. This was it, the formal confrontation. I walked in with Ben and Uncle Arthur by my side. Clara was already there with her legal team. She wouldn't look at me. She stared at the polished table, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of her arrogance. The mediator, a stern but fair woman, laid out the ground rules. No interruptions, no personal attacks. Our side would present its case, then her side would respond. Ben began, his voice calm and methodical. He didn't start with the money. He started with the letter. He read it aloud, just as Father Michael had. In the cold, quiet room, the words had an even greater weight. Then he laid out the rest of it. He presented Maria's forensic accounting report, a thick binder filled with spreadsheets and highlighted statements that documented the financial bleed. He presented Mrs. Gable's signed affidavit. He presented phone records showing hundreds of unanswered calls from my number to my mother's house. It was an avalanche of evidence, a systematic, undeniable dismantling of Clara's entire narrative. As Ben spoke, I watched my sister. She was shrinking in her chair, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. The wall of her denial was being breached, brick by brick. When it was her lawyer's turn to speak, his argument was weak. He tried to claim undue influence on my part, suggesting I had somehow manipulated my mother into writing the letter after her death, a ludicrous proposition. He tried to frame the financial transactions as gifts, a sign of a loving mother helping her daughter. But the sheer volume of our evidence was overwhelming. The mediator listened patiently. After both sides had spoken, she looked at Clara. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy, "your sister has presented a substantial case for breach of fiduciary duty and undue influence. The evidence of financial misappropriation is, frankly, compelling. Before we proceed, I want you to understand that if this goes before a judge, the outcome is unlikely to be in your favor. Furthermore, your sister's lawyer could very well forward this file to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." That was the key. The threat of criminal charges. I saw a flicker of pure terror in Clara's eyes. Prison. Public humiliation beyond what she'd already suffered. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear. After a long, tense negotiation in separate rooms, they capitulated. The agreement we reached was a bitter pill for her to swallow. The will would be nullified. The estate would be divided equally between us, but only after Clara repaid the $87,000 she had misappropriated with interest. She would be forced to sell her new SUV to cover part of it. She was also required to sign a document formally acknowledging her actions had caused significant emotional distress to both me and our mother. The house, which held so many memories, both good and bad, would be sold, the proceeds split. It was a victory, a legal, financial, and factual victory. But as I signed the papers, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. It was a bittersweet verdict. I had won back the money. I had cleared my name. I had honored my mother's last wish, but justice felt incomplete. No court order could give me back the years I'd lost with my mother. No settlement could heal the wound of my sister's betrayal. Clara would never face a jury. She would pay the money, but she would likely never truly comprehend the depth of the pain she had caused. She was remorseless, and the legal system couldn't fix that. In the months that followed the settlement, I began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The first thing I did was sever the final ties. I sent a single, brief, formal email to Clara and to the handful of relatives who had remained her staunch defenders. It said simply, "For the sake of my own well-being, I am choosing to end our relationship. Please do not contact me again." I blocked their numbers. I blocked them on social media. I erected a permanent, non-negotiable boundary. It was the final act of reclamation, a declaration that my peace was more valuable than any twisted notion of family obligation. The house sold quickly. Sorting through Mom's belongings was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Every photograph, every piece of sheet music, every worn gardening glove was a memory. I kept the things that mattered: her recipe box, her favorite armchair, the shoebox where I had found the letter. The rest I donated. I let go of the physical space that had become a prison for her and a source of pain for me. With my share of the estate and the money Clara had been forced to repay, I was financially secure for the first time in my life, but the money felt heavy, tainted by its origins. I didn't want it for myself. After talking it over with Uncle Arthur and Ben, I used a significant portion of it to establish a small charitable foundation in my mother's name, the Eleanor Vance Project. It provides grants and legal support for victims of elder abuse, helping others fight the same kind of battles I had faced. It turned my mother's suffering, and my own, into something constructive, something that could protect others. I continued with therapy, learning to process the complex grief for my mother, but also grief for the sister I once had, or thought I had, long before jealousy and cruelty consumed her. I learned to live with the scars. They were a part of my story now, a reminder of my own resilience. I learned that recovery isn't a destination. It's a daily practice. Some days were harder than others. A passing scent of gardenias could bring tears to my eyes. A news story about family disputes could make my stomach clench, but the moments of peace began to outnumber the moments of pain. I never heard from Clara again directly. Uncle Arthur told me she had moved to a different state after the house was sold, ashamed to face the community where her disgrace had become common knowledge. She had paid her debt, but I doubted she had found any peace. Her prison was now one of her own making, built from the ashes of her lies. One cool autumn afternoon, about a year after the funeral, I drove back to my hometown. I went to the cemetery. The grass had grown in around the granite headstone I had chosen. Eleanor Vance. Beloved mother, she is at peace. I laid a small bouquet of white lilies on the grave. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. There was no more drama, no more fighting. There was just a quiet sense of closure. The world was no longer tilted. I had found my balance again. The legal victory was partial. The emotional wounds would likely always remain, but in that quiet moment, standing by my mother's grave, I felt a sense of a different kind of justice. The justice of survival. The justice of living a good life, a free life, not in spite of the shadows, but beyond them. I had my mother's love, the last clear thing in her mind, and I had my freedom, and I knew, finally, that it was enough. So, yeah, that was a whole thing. A whole ridiculously long, emotionally draining thing. If you're still here, still listening to this, you deserve a medal, or at least a very comfortable chair and a strong beverage of your choice. I mean, seriously, who sits through all that? You're clearly a person of refined taste and immense patience. I appreciate you. Now that we've thoroughly exhausted the topic of my deeply dysfunctional family, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. It's way less complicated than suing a sibling, I promise.